The German Benedictine abbot Anselm Grun notes that Jesus was evidently an experienced therapist. He could diagnose anyone. He takes aside the deaf and dumb man so that he can give him special treatment. The man was evidently been struck dumb, so he needs a protected space in which to venture to speak again. Blindness is often connected with our not wanting to see things. Jesus touches the blind man tenderly. He lays hands on him. Since the first treatment isn't completely successful, Jesus lays his hands on the man's eyes once more. Now the blind man can see clearly. Jesus knows what each individual feels and how to awaken new life in them. The leper can't bear himself. You can hear the hesitation in the question. If you choose, you can make me clean. Because he rejects himself, he feels an outcast, completely isolated. Great patience is required before those who reject themselves can accept care from the outside. The healing takes place in several stages. Jesus had compassion on him. He stretched out his hand. He touched him and said, I do choose, be made clean. The first step in Jesus' therapy consists in compassion. The Greek word for compassion literally means being moved in the gut. Jesus allows the leper to enter the area of his vulnerable feelings. Then he stretches out his hand. He creates a relationship with the sick person. He doesn't treat him as an object. He offers him his hand and makes contact with him. He embraces him. Literally, that's what the Greek word here means. By touching a leper, Jesus makes himself unclean. He dirties his hands. He doesn't just see the inner bitterness and the accumulated resentment from the outside. He touches the other person in his leprosy. There are many who prefer to steer clear of such people. They have the impression they'll be infected by them. Jesus doesn't have this fear. He touches the other person, and then he says, I do choose, be made clean. Jesus stands by the other person. The community of the church is also called to reach out to those who are excluded. Father Richard Rohr says that at the edge of any system, and those excluded from any system, ironically and invariably hold the secret for the conversion and wholeness of that very group. Only as the people of God receive the stranger, the sinner, and the immigrant, do we discover not only the hidden, feared, and hated part of our own souls, but the fullness of Jesus himself. The church is always converted when the outcasts are reinvited back into the temple. You see this in Jesus sending marginalized people to show themselves to the priest. It's not just for their reinclusion and acceptance, but actually for the group to be renewed itself. Paul is making a similar point to the church at Corinth. Some of their behavior is tearing the community apart. Paul reminds them, all things are lawful, but not all things build up. The specific issue is meat sacrificed to idols. But for Christians, obviously, idols are nothing. Here was a chance to get protein for dinner at the bargain meat counter. But some people found this inappropriate and unacceptable. They wouldn't eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols. So Paul wrote that his own choice was to act in such a way that he would not be the source of scandal against his fellow Christians. In chapter 8 he wrote, therefore, if food causes my brother to sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I may not cause my brother to sin. Paul continually reminds us, you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. With the freedom won through Jesus Christ is the responsibility that the individual has toward the community. Decisions that we make that we might think are our own private business, in fact, have social consequences. There's no such thing as a sin that hurts no one. Paul emphasizes that rather than think of our choices as simply our own business, we have to recognize our responsibility to others as well. Richard Rohr captures the difference between the secular and religious freedom. He said, secular freedom is having to do what you want to do. Religious freedom is wanting to do what you have to do. If you choose, you can make me clean. Jesus wants to make the leper clean because Jesus is living inside of God's covenant love, and there is no one outside of God's love. Walter Brueggemann defines covenant as a radical alternative to consumer autonomy. But living within community does not come easily. It's always costly. Jesus sternly warned the leper not to tell anyone, but he went out and began to announce it freely, to spread the word, so that Jesus could no longer go into a town openly. The leper was restored to community, but then Jesus became the outcast. Jack Shea wonders, when crutches were thrown away, did Jesus limp after the running cripples? Did his eyes dim when Bartimaeus saw? Did life ebb in him when it flowed in Lazarus? When lepers leapt in new flesh, did scales appear on the back of his hand? The Gospels say Jesus felt power go out from him, but neglect to say whether at that moment pain came in. Did the Son of God take on ungrown legs and dead eyes in the terrifying knowledge that pain does not go away, only moves on? Shea is capturing an essential element of the covenant that Jesus makes with us. In the Eucharist, Jesus is not only present, but he also makes present his sacrificial death for us. Jesus died for us and for the many. Ron Rolheiser, in a recent column, observed that at every Eucharist, we memorialize the gift that Jesus made of his death. But that memorial includes, too, the sacrificial gift of everyone who has imitated Jesus' self-love and sacrifice. In the Eucharist, the sacrifice of Christ that we memorialize includes the sacrifice of all who have died, however unconsciously, for the many. Every time we show compassion and enter into someone's vulnerability, Christ is present. Every time we reach out our hand and touch someone in need of comfort, Christ is present. Every time we set aside our own freedom to stand instead in someone else's shoes, Christ is present. Every time we treat someone with gentleness, being careful so as not to break the bruised reed or extinguish the smoldering wick, Christ is present. Every time we are faithful to the promise of love, Christ is present and life is full.